I'll start with the fact that, as is known, US President Donald Trump essentially fled from Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. The American leader left the G7 summit ahead of schedule. Moreover, earlier this morning, it was officially announced by CBS News that the United States is currently advocating for a somewhat softer and more conciliatory wording in the G7's final statement regarding Russia in an effort to shape the international response. In other words, they are not satisfied with condemning Russia's actions for the acts of terror committed by the Kremlin. This, of course, is cynical, it is unpleasant, but it is a fact that needs to be analyzed and understood what is happening and what will come next. Well, first of all, this is once again a moment of truth for the European countries, for the G7 members, and not only them. How ready are they to act autonomously, independently, understanding that the issue of European security is in their hands and that the only one who can now help them guarantee and ensure this security is Ukraine. This is in the literal sense, and there simply cannot be any misinterpretation here, because it is here that the war is ongoing. It is right now that Ukrainian forces are resisting and, among other things, repelling numerous enemy attacks. In addition, it must be said that the defense forces of Ukraine are doing this quite successfully despite the intense pressure from the enemy not allowing the adversary to break into the Dnipropetrovsk region, expand their foothold in the Sumy region, or advance further in the Kupiansk direction. The attacks are being repelled, and moreover, conditions are being created for transitioning to local counteroffensive tactical actions. But at the same time, we see that Trump has left, and as of now, at the time I'm recording this video, he still has not commented on the strike on Kyiv, the horrific terrorist attack where people were killed. Many were injured, and there is extensive destruction, particularly of residential buildings. And last night, the enemy attacked Zaporizhia, once again, another act of terror. President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, who arrived at the G7 summit, commented on this situation as follows. He noted that while last year the use of 100 shaheeds in a single night caused real shock, now it already seems unusual if fewer than 100 drones are used in one attack. In fact, this is the only real change in Russia's behavior after the change of the US president. And this proves that those who support new and stronger sanctions against Russia are absolutely right. Here, the president of Ukraine very skillfully and subtly hinted that as of today, the security situation with Russia's strikes and its terror has only gotten worse. Putin only allows himself more, only acts more brazenly and more cruelly. And as of today, he is being stopped by the defense forces of Ukraine, those who repel attacks at the front, those who plan and carry out successful and brilliant operations on Russian territory. And here I'll give a little spoiler without details. Soon we will see many more interesting things that will make us proud of our defense and security forces of Ukraine, especially through actions aimed at destroying certain targets on Russian territory. No one will simply stand by and watch as the enemy strikes our country, destroys it, and causes suffering. No, the war will move on to Russian territory. This is the strategic campaign of Ukraine's defense forces for the summer and autumn of this year. So moving on, the president clearly states what has changed. There have been more attacks. Putin continues his terror after the change of president, hinting that Trump is not doing enough right now. I think you would all agree, because the American president is currently just constantly extending deadlines, giving Putin more time. It really seems as if this time is being given so that Russia can strike more at Ukrainian territory and pressure us into some kind of compromises, concessions, and so on. Moreover, the United States still has not made a decision to this day regarding future aid packages for our country. We are still continuing to receive only what was promised by the previous US administration under President Joe Biden. But so far, there are no new decisions. However, the fight to ensure that these decisions are made is ongoing. Next, the president of Ukraine, Zelensky notes. Today, well, actually yesterday, just in the evening Kiev time, late at night, Volodymyr Zelensky was speaking, and here is what he said. Today in Kiev, about 30 locations were recorded where missiles struck or debris fell. Almost 150 residential buildings were damaged in Kiev alone. At present, it is known that 131 people were injured and 15 have died. Unfortunately, this number increased by morning, and according to preliminary data, there are already more fatalities. Among the dead is a citizen of the United States. I urge you to cooperate with the United States to implement a strict price cap on Russian oil. Currently, the proposed price is $45 per barrel, but many experts agree that the truly effective level is $30. Together, we must make this painful for Russia. It is equally important to provide 40 billion US dollars in annual budgetary support for Ukraine for our resilience so that our country can keep going. And this must be a joint decision by the leaders, including the United States. Well, that's an absolutely correct position. It is clearly articulated, but will Trump hear this? Is he ready to be? So far, it seems that he is not, and the aid remains in a state of suspension. That is why there are calls to our European partners that we need to jointly invest in weapons production and develop the Ukrainian defense industry's manufacturing capabilities. We have positive examples of implementation with the countries of Northern Europe. The Danish initiative, where we jointly produce artillery systems, and there are already quite a few such examples. Now, practically every international meeting includes on its agenda, among other things, the issue of investing in the Ukrainian military-industrial complex in our defense sector with the aim of joint weapons production with our partners, because this is one of the solutions for strengthening our defense capability and our ability to counter the enemy. Britain has already responded, and Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of Britain, is indeed advocating for strengthening sanctions against Russia. As Starmer said, I want to work together with all our G7 partners to limit Russia's energy revenues and reduce the funds it can invest in its illegal war. Britain has already imposed sanctions on more than 2,300 individuals, organizations, and vessels as part of its sanctions against Russia. Starmer is expected to deliver a speech in which he will argue that Russia does not hold all the cards and will call on allies to seize this moment to increase economic pressure and show Putin that it is in his interest to demonstrate a commitment to peace. And French President Macron stated that he still believes Washington can support strengthening sanctions against Russia, despite Trump having said the opposite. Well, for now, unfortunately, we see that Washington is not ready yet, at least judging by what Trump has said, and, for example, the activity of Senator Lindsey Graham and others, who co-authored the bill to strengthen sanctions and introduce draconian restrictions against the Kremlin, has somehow decreased. Sanctions, by the way, are not enough, because what is needed is a steady supply of weapons, support, provision, and response. A response to events as is happening in relation to Israel. This is what's important. You see, the issue is not only about us discussing the adoption of decisions right now. The issue is in the response. The issue is in political assessments. The issue is in determination. The issue is in courage. Because I understand that Trump can now directly demand the complete capitulation of Iran, and to say and to hint to Ayatollah Ali Khamenei that we know where you are, where you live, implying that he could be eliminated. But why don't they talk to Putin like that? That's the real question. That's how one should talk to Putin. That's the kind of statement that should be made at least once. I'm convinced that this would significantly boost Trump's ratings and demonstrate his decisiveness and leadership. But the fact that we have to deal with the Yemeni Houthis, strike them, and now decide whether to help Israel or not, most likely the United States will not help. will not get involved in the war. Most likely, but we'll see. Obviously, it looks, like a convenient enemy to shift the focus onto and to wage some kind of victorious war for themselves, for their own positions, to demonstrate their strength, because questions are already arising here as well, and to distract from a certain difficult internal situation in the United States. Let me remind you that there is currently a large protest movement against Trump called No King. It has spread across all the states, throughout the major cities, and especially in California. And the situation is quite complicated, an internal political one now unfolding for the American president. And how will he respond? Well, do you understand why Macron is saying this? Macron is also saying this because obviously France is working at the state level, at the level of administrations, at the level of the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the US State Department, and so on. And the institutions, they operate differently. That is, in the United States, there is a deep state formed in a good sense, and Trump wants to destroy it. In other words, he wants to bring these institutions completely under his control, which goes against the very nature of the United States of America country that was created precisely so that these strong independent institutions would develop decisions, make proposals, and then implement them based on the national interests of the US, the preservation of America's leadership in the world, and accordingly, the recommendations given to the American president. And of course, I am convinced that the deep state thinks very differently from Trump. They do not like this. They even assess things differently. Even Tulsi Gabbard, who is the head of the US intelligence community, a controversial figure, but who became the head of intelligence and provides assessments of the situation, said that Iran does not currently have nuclear weapons. Still, Trump commented on this and said, I don't care what she said. I think differently. So if he reacts even to his own intelligence community like that, well, it's a sign that maybe we should think about it, but we'll see. By the way, not everyone in the Republican Party shares Trump's opinion on this either. For example, Don Bacon, a congressman from the Republican Party, criticized the idea of allowing Russia back into the G7 and noted that as long as Russia does not stop its aggression in Ukraine, it has no place there. The G7 should remain exactly as it is, without allowing Russia back to the table of meetings of the world's leading countries. At least until Moscow ends its aggression against Ukraine. This is how Don Bacon, a fellow party member and congressman, responded to the US president's remarks about Russia returning to the gate. In other words, not all Republicans, something I have mentioned repeatedly, support Trump's policies. And right now we're talking about the fact that yes, Trump is still making certain statements, but in the future, this could become grounds for his impeachment. You see, the Republicans are approaching the upcoming midterm elections, and they understand perfectly well that Trump's actions will be evaluated by Republican voters in particular, and those, let's say, already controversial moments, situations, and decisions that have occurred will hardly inspire enthusiasm among everyone within the United States. And so the question really arises here. Well, as I've already mentioned, Trump says that he wants to resolve the situation with Iran. There has been some movement. Indeed, the Americans are redeploying their refueling aircraft from the United States. These planes are heading first to Europe, but they are being redeployed at the request of CENTCOM. CENTCOM is precisely the American Command for Forces in the Middle East. In other words, they are moving according to their request. And obviously, this is to strengthen the capabilities and capacities of American aviation, specifically in the Middle East, in the context of the current Israeli-Iranian war. There is no doubt about that. Indeed, there are maneuvers by American ships near Bahrain, where one of the largest US bases in the Middle East is located. All of this is happening, but will it lead to the US entering the war against Iran? There is a chance, because once again, Trump feels the need to demonstrate some kind of strength as he sees it, since China is already advancing. And the fact that China is rapidly modernizing its nuclear arsenal, I've mentioned this in previous videos as well. And now Xi Jinping has also made a statement, a rather philosophical, rhetorical one, in many ways, in that typically Chinese manner, just as the Chinese Communist Party likes to do these days. So Xi pointed this out and simply drew historical analogies and parallels, saying that any empire eventually ceases to exist. And he was hinting specifically at the United States of America and that the world order could be changed. In other words, China already sees a certain weakness in America right now, a real one, in terms of how weakened it appears on the international stage, and is already starting to talk about the possibility of a new leader emerging, hinting at China itself. So I'll put it this way: Trump might take a lot upon himself. He takes on a lot, thinking that much is permitted to him. But American institutions and the so-called deep state think very differently. They believe that it is necessary to act based on protecting the national interests of the United States and maintaining leadership on the international stage. So that's the situation here. And secondly, you see, when it comes to talking about a campaign against Iran, nothing will work here without ground troops. Air power alone won't be enough, and Trump was actually opposed to that. He criticized the decisions of his predecessors for getting involved in the wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and so on. And I just want to remind you that all the campaigns conducted by the United States of America took place with the involvement of the Air Force, which carried out massive strikes over a long period. The first Gulf War, 1990, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait from Iraq, and the United States intervened. At that time, President George H.W. Bush said that he would not let this stand. Then, for a month, an air campaign was carried out, but afterwards, from two directions, from Saudi Arabia and directly from Saudi Arabia, Iraq was attacked from both sides, and Kuwait was liberated by ground forces, the US Marine Corps, and other components of the US Army. So there was a ground contingent. The same thing happened in Afghanistan. They thought they could eliminate bin Laden and suppress Al Qaeda with air operations. No, in the end, they went in on the ground. The same goes for the second Iraq campaign. So he might end up creating exactly what he was opposed to. And it's unlikely that this will boost his ratings within the Republican Party, although we'll see. By the way, notice that right now, the media hardly mentioned the campaign against the Yemeni Houthis, even though the US started this campaign and carried out attacks. And in fact, nothing so far, there's no news. Did they destroy them or not? There's basically no information. So getting involved against Iran is a completely different matter. Besides, what are the risks here? If the US gets drawn into this war, it will undoubtedly shift the entire focus of international media to the Middle East. And that would be a gift to Trumpsery, to Putin, if indeed there are signs to believe that Trump was recruited by Russian intelligence services, then he might do this and it would be solely in Putin's interests. But this could ultimately lead to the impeachment of the American president, because only Putin is interested in having the US destroy Iran right now. They don't care about their own partners. That's been clear for a long time. They obviously don't care about Iran either. That's absolutely clear. And they would like the US to get involved, because that would give the Kremlin a free hand to continue its own terror. Besides, this would increase oil prices, which would boost the enemy's revenues for waging war. So, in fact, this way Trump could help Putin destroy Europe and spread danger across the European continent. That essentially is what the risks are. But for now, I don't see that from the US. I mean, all these actions relocating planes, ships can only really be discussed once some time has passed and we can actually see the movement of American troops, additional aircraft, and so on. Only then can we talk about it. And all of this, after all, takes time. Meanwhile, our other partners are responding. Canada has announced a new military aid package for Ukraine worth 2 billion Canadian dollars, which is approximately 1.5 billion US dollars. This was reported by the Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney. We are providing Ukraine with additional support drones, helicopters, and ammunition. This amounts to more than $2 billion in direct military support for Kyiv. In addition, the Prime Minister announced the expansion of sanctions against the Russian Federation. The restrictions have been imposed on a number of individuals and more than 40 organizations both in Russia and abroad. The sanctions target those companies that help Moscow circumvent existing restrictions. Canada has also imposed sanctions on 200 vessels of Russia's so-called shadow fleet, which are used to transport oil in violation of international bans. Here are the decisions made directly by Canada. Similarly, Britain has expanded its sanctions, and this is important. Meanwhile, Shoigu, the former Russian defense minister and now the secretary of the Security Council of the Russian Federation, visited North Korea, where he met with Kim Jong-un. And as usual, the main agenda of this meeting was, of course, North Korea's assistance to Russia. Obviously, Shoigu was begging, pleading with Kim Jong-un to provide more soldiers, to supply more weapons and equipment that North Korea possesses. But after the North Korean troops were defeated in Kursk, crushed by the defense forces of Ukraine, Kim Jong-un no longer wants to send additional troops and instead promised laborers to help rebuild the Kursk region, as well as sappers. In other words, he promised construction battalions, builders and engineers and sappers. That's it. As for military personnel who would directly take part in combat operations, Kim Jong-un currently does not want to send them. Again, this is due to the colossal losses he has already suffered, and also because, well, he just doesn't want to continue. And he tells the Russians, okay, you keep providing us with technology for implementing the program to build nuclear submarines, strengthening our space program, and also for aviation and so on. And in return, we'll send you, well, sappers like them, do the work. Meanwhile, Iran is preparing to withdraw from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. This means that a bill is being prepared by Iranian parliamentarians to withdraw from the Non-Proliferation Treaty and so on. Well, obviously, this is all just for show, all a media spectacle. They've been pressured. Israel has put quite serious pressure on Iran, and this is clearly noticeable. Now they're trying to put on a brave face, but the situation there is also complicated. It's not easy for Israel either right now, which is asking for help from the United States of America. And here's an example of how oil prices react and why it's beneficial for us that the situation in the Middle East normalizes as quickly as possible. The point is that Reuters provides statistics. So, Brent crude futures, which is Russian, rose 34 cents, 0.5%, and are now 73.5 US dollars. American oil has increased in price by 29 cents. During the previous trading session, both contracts rose by more than 2%. On Monday, at the same time, on June 16th, oil prices dropped by more than 1% amid hopes that the conflict would subside. In a media report about Iran's desire to end the war, here is an example of how this works. That is, there is a message that war is possible and the market immediately feels it. On the other hand, if it drags on and, for example, the United States might enter the war, the market responds accordingly